Welcome everybody to the South Asia Initiative's first event of the spring quarter. Today we are discussing Afghanistan and efforts to resolve the conflict there. I had hoped this event would be quite current and help us make sense of the latest news, but I didn't anticipate there would be quite so much news so quickly. Just hours ago, President Biden set a new deadline of September the 11th for the withdrawal, the complete withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan. And yesterday, was it just yesterday? I think the Taliban announced that it would not participate in the highly anticipated peace conference in Turkey, which was due to start in just a couple of days and now won't, presumably. So the news is coming pretty thick and fast. But our aim in these events generally, and certainly today, is to understand the news by understand the underlying trends and implications of the issue. This is what we're going to try and do today. And to do that, we have two of the, I think, smartest and most accomplished scholars of Afghanistan joining us. You can read their full bios on the website for this event, but let me just introduce them very quickly. In alphabetical order, Asfandyar Mir is a postdoc fellow at Stanford. He's an expert in irregular war and counterinsurgency, and he's a regular commentator and decipherer of events in Afghanistan in platforms like the Washington Post. Dipali Mukhopadhyay is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota and formerly at Columbia, and she is an expert in state building and governance in war. And she's also serving as a senior expert at the US Institute of Peace, including for the congressionally mandated Afghanistan study group. Asfandyar and Dipali, welcome. We have a ton to get through, so let me just make a quick housekeeping announcement before we get underway. Like all our events, this will be a Q&A format. And I invite you out there in Zoom land to submit questions, but please make them brief. You can use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. Time will be short, so please bear with me. I will be pretty ruthless in picking questions and bundling them together. So please keep them brief and keep them relevant. So let's begin. We begin with today's announcement. We now know formally what I think everyone has suspected, that the US's original withdrawal deadline of May the 1st is now postponed, and the new deadline is September the 11th. So it looks like, and in fact some officials have said in press reporting, that the US has given up on a conditions-based withdrawal. Dipali, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Afghanistan study group wanted to stick to the conditions-based withdrawal idea. But as I said in the press, some officials have said that's out the window. Is that correct? Are we now in a situation where conditions essentially no longer matter?
Thanks, Arzan, so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a good day to have friends to process this pretty remarkable news with, and I'm a huge fan of Asfandyar's work, and whenever I need to know what's happening, I just go to his Twitter account. So I'm really keen to hear his thoughts. You are right that the Afghan study group, which was congressionally mandated, and the US Institute of Peace was asked to hold the pen for that report, did in fact make the recommendation that the US reinforce, in its words, the conditionality of final troop withdrawal. And the title of this event, as you put it, was "Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed," which was Ambassador Khalilzad's catchphrase for his philosophy, as we understood it, in terms of thinking about the relationship between the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan and the resolution of the conflict on the ground there. The short answer for me, as I understand it, is that phrase is defunct. As of now, I think Some would argue that the troop withdrawal has been divorced from intra-Afghan negotiation process, even during the Trump administration's time. But I was quite struck by the way in which the senior administration official today underscored the fact that, in fact, the troop withdrawal will not be held hostage, in effect, to the progress of the intra-Afghan negotiations.
Right. Yeah, and that's certainly been the concern of some Afghan watchers, that what the US wants to do with its force posture in country is no longer going to be related to the peace process. Asfandyar, is that how you see it as well? Are we now in a world where that was sort of an uncomfortable suspicion for some time, but it now seems to be openly US policy, that these two things are two separate things? US withdrawal and whatever happens in Afghanistan is a separate issue.
I agree with that, and let me start by thanking you for convening this conversation. Really great to be here, and of course, big fan of Dipali. I've learned from her work. Her book is among my favorite works on state building. Highly recommended. So, as Dipali noted, the fact that that the senior administration official who spoke or who announced the withdrawal to the press in a background phone call, he really emphasized the fact that the administration is not going to commit to a conditions-based withdrawal. And the next point this person made was that troops or keeping troops in theater is not contributing leverage for these ongoing talks and discussions, which of course runs contrary to a lot of analytic wisdom that has existed on the peace process, that perhaps retaining troops in country is a source of leverage. It's something that allows the US to extract a better deal from the Taliban. The Biden administration has concluded that's not the case. So that's important. I think, and I'm in some ways I'm not surprised by that. I think it's been clear if you watch how the type of things that the Taliban do respond to. They stopped responding to military pressure some time ago. You can try to exert more military pressure. There are certainly limits to how much you can pressure them in the first place. But to the extent the U.S. forces were able to exert any pressure, that did not manifest in any meaningful movement on the negotiating table. So perhaps the Biden administration is reflecting that view in this final assessment. But at the same time, the question remains: what are some of the remaining tools of leverage that the administration sees it has available to manage this intra-Afghan process? What are these diplomatic tools? What are some of the tools to manage the counterterrorism concerns? The administration today said that it is going to try to hold the Taliban accountable. The question is, how will you hold the Taliban accountable if you're not going to have any kind of troops in the country? I'm not saying that you should keep troops in the country. I'm more open to U.S. forces pulling out, but the administration for now is not telling us what are some of the tools, instruments, levers it feels it has available to exercise, some type of options and exert pressure on the Taliban.
Yeah, I want to discuss the issue of leverage in a minute, but maybe since you raised it, let me just follow up on this issue really quickly. A few days ago, although it feels like longer than that, Secretary of State Blinken made some reference to international recognition as being something that the Taliban would want, and implicitly a form of leverage that the US could use over the Taliban to get the Taliban to the peace table. Does that really matter to the Taliban? Is that what the US is left with in terms of leverage over the Taliban? Is it just sort of diplomatic global recognition of a Afghan government that includes the Taliban?
I think there are two sources of leverage that remain, and I will take this opportunity to make a plug for at USIP. We've got a peace process page, an Afghan peace process page dedicated to just research that we're publishing on these questions related immediately to the process. And I think today it's actually gone live, a paper by Barney Rubin about the Taliban's longstanding wish for international recognition. And there are a couple pieces of that, I think, that are relevant. One is clearly the Taliban signaled from the beginning its interest to be engaged by the United States, its interest to be engaged in international platforms that afford it a kind of legitimacy at the expense of the Afghan government, as it were. And the second piece of that is that the Taliban is still subject to a set of, punishing sanctions in that the UN Security Council has control over. So there's recognition. There's also relief that I think members of the group arguably seek. But I think probably the most significant leverage that the international community and the US in particular continue to have, and this was actually embedded within the Doha Agreement between the Americans and the Taliban, is the need on the part of any Afghan government for ongoing international aid. No Afghan government since the late 19th century has survived without international support and without arrangements that have been problematic for a variety of reasons, but really central to regime survival from that time to today. And the Taliban, having experienced the isolation of the 1990s, seems to have internalized that particular lesson. And so I think one of the things that was important to listen for was Secretary Blinken's comment that you referred to, but also reference to other forms of aid that would materialize. And there was some reference basically in this statement today from the senior official to the fact that that kind of aid will materialize under certain conditions, right? And those conditions reference human rights protection, women's rights protection. And I think that was a way of suggesting that this instrument of aid and the recognition that's required to receive it, that those two instruments for leverage still exist.
Just quickly on that point of international recognition, agree with everything that Dipali just said. But I think the big question now is that how much international recognition and support can the US deny to the Taliban? So I agree that the Taliban want some type of international legitimacy and recognition. But US's ability to deny that has been reduced over the last few years. The Taliban has assiduously worked to cultivate international supporters beyond Pakistan. So Pakistan was the only supporter it had in the post 9/11 period, but now the Taliban has a relationship with Russia. They have a working relationship with Iran. Obviously, they're based in Qatar and they've gone to China. So the Taliban, I think, is banking on the fact that it has developed a lot of these important diplomatic relationships, which will hold out in case it is able to acquire some type of power. UN sanctions certainly remain a concern for them. They are punishing, and they're a source of leverage for the US. And obviously, the lifting these sanctions would require consensus across the P5. On aid, finally, yes, the US is going to be ultimately the biggest benefactor if the US decides to support. But even here, I feel the Taliban assess that they can marshal some type of aid from non-US sources, perhaps even China.
This is a really good point. The fact that the US is no longer the decisive factor in what form of recognition Kabul may or may not get in a post-power sharing arrangement. But this actually raises for me another question that ties together what you just both said with what we were talking about before when we're talking about conditions. And Dipali, you mentioned you referenced the Doha Agreement. The core quid pro quo for US withdrawal was Taliban, and we have to be careful with the verb we use here, either breaking links with or not allowing the support, the recruitment, the training for Al-Qaeda. So combining those two factors, the fact that the US leverage is now going to be less military, at least, if not reduced overall, it's going to at least be less military. Does that mean now, where does that leave the Doha Agreement? If the US has already announced it's going to withdraw, where does that leave the other side of that agreement, which is the undertaking by the Taliban to break links with or not allow the continued support for Al-Qaeda?
I don't know. I think it's a really good question. I mean, I would defer to Asfandyar on what the ongoing nature of the relationship is between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but my sense is that they have not broken those ties. And, perhaps more importantly than, what kind of affinity and affiliation they are opting to have, they certainly are not capable or have not demonstrated an interest in preventing these groups from continuing to enact attacks within Afghanistan. Little reason to believe, as Asfandyar was saying, one of the interesting things about insurgencies is that they shop around for foreign patronage, right? And for the Taliban, the possibility of I would imagine one of the options for compensating for other forms of international support that may ebb would be non-state armed networks or actors who are sympathetic to those networks. So I don't think there's any reason to believe that a decision to withdraw under the current circumstances, not only without being conditional to the progress in the peace process, but certainly not based on robust evidence of counter-terror progress on the part of the Taliban. Now that withdrawal has been made clear and that it's going to happen, it seems unlikely to me that the Taliban is incentivized to be more aggressive in countering the Al-Qaeda presence, whatever it may be. I will say maybe on the slightly more optimistic side of this, there was this troika meeting of the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the Pakistanis. And if I'm remembering right, out of that meeting came a statement on the part of the Russians and the Chinese and Americans that indicated a lack of appetite on their part for an Emirates reemergence in Afghanistan. And so I think I totally agree with Asfandyar that there will be limits on how the US can manage Taliban behavior, either through the giving of carrots or the wielding of sticks. But I do think that there appears to be little appetite in the region for the emergence of a full-blown emirate, and I would think that would be coupled with a lack of appetite also for the reemergence of Al-Qaeda, which would pose an immediate threat to everybody in the region. So from that perspective, my hope would be that, and I'm sure we'll get into this, that a regionalized approach, an approach that thinks about where other actors have leverage, might be able to manage some of the Taliban's behavior going forward. But to me, the Doha Declaration, I'm not sure there's much more to extract from that given today's announcement.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a little bit. And Asfandyar, maybe you can respond to this. The fact that to date, that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have not, there's no evidence that they've broken their connection, their affiliation. And the fact that despite that fact, the Taliban, as Asfandyar said, has been cultivating partners around the world, seems to suggest that there is a level of tolerance that, fine, people may not want a re-emergence of an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan, But does that matter? I mean, even in a power sharing agreement or an Afghanistan where the Taliban retains influence, if it hasn't broken its links with Al Qaeda can still persist there. So is an emirate really important, whether or not it exists? And B, haven't we seen that countries have a degree of tolerance for this relationship? The fact that we are where we are today, with the US withdrawing, with the Taliban cultivating its relationships, seems to suggest that there is a level of tolerance for this, as long as we're not seeing repeated, 9/11s, Madrids, Balis, international terrorism coming from the region, then it seems to be tolerable. What do you say, Asfandyar?
I think I agree with you. So you're not being a devil's advocate here. I think today there is more tolerance for some of these terrorist threats across countries. And why go far? Let's start here at home. I think the administration is resigned to the fact that forcing a Taliban break with Al Qaeda is a lost cause. I think the Trump administration started internalizing this point. Many Afghan watchers have either directly or implicitly argued this particular position for a long time, but at the level of the US government, this realization began to sink in or was internalized through the midway of the Trump admin, and the Biden administration very much has retained this sense, and it feels that its best option is to mount an offshore counterterrorism capability, a combination of drones, special operations forces, surveillance platforms, to manage this particular threat. And I think the U.S. counterterrorism community draws some solace from its campaigns in say Yemen, Somalia, northwestern Syria, where Al Qaeda exists. Al Qaeda has affiliates which are engaged in some type of external plotting, but the U.S. government is able to proactively identify those threats and neutralize them before they grow involved and start reaching the homeland. So that's where the U.S. is at. I think it's a similar situation with both Russia and China. They worry about the threat that some of these Sunni jihadists might pose, within their homelands, but they have far more tolerance for the existence of some of these Salafi jihadist actors, even in countries of their allies. Pakistan is another actor. Pakistan has long been very comfortable with sort of coexisting as well as instrumentalizing some of these actors, as tools of its foreign policy. So there's no news there. But quickly on the point of the Taliban's relationship with Al Qaeda, I think a lot of people focus on this battlefield collaboration, the fact that Al Qaeda has provided some type of advisory or actual fighting capability to the Taliban. My sense is that indeed Al Qaeda has provided that type of support, but it tends to be overstated, and the real source of alignment between the two groups remains political. There is an elite level pact between Al Qaeda's core group and the Taliban's top leadership, be it the Haqqani network, but I think it extends beyond the Haqqani network. And this relationship very much remains intact. The Taliban is extremely committed to shielding Al Qaeda, even if it doesn't sign on to Al Qaeda's transnational operation. Most worryingly, however, Al Qaeda pledges allegiance to the chief of the Taliban. It portrays the chief of the Taliban as essentially a caliphate in waiting. And so Al Qaeda affiliates from West Africa to South Asia see the leader of the Afghan Taliban as their leader. And I worry about the international politics and implications of this type of allegiance. What does that mean? Is that an international political vertical that the Taliban are going to work, as Dipali mentioned, to mobilize support for itself, in the form of donations perhaps, or some other form of material aid that it might need, should the international community try to isolate a Taliban-led political order in Afghanistan?
Yeah. I will get back to the idea to what a post power sharing agreement government looks like. But Dipali, before I do that, one last question on this counterterrorism issue. The Afghan Study Group, among every other report on Afghanistan, very clearly says that preventing transnational terrorism emanating from Afghanistan is a if not the primary US policy concern. So it sounds like where we're coming down, where the US government position is coming down on this, is that it can, that it seems to, again, tolerate a certain existence of Al-Qaeda, but do you think it will be satisfied that it can at least make an agreement or through offshore counterterrorism activities prevent this core US policy concern, or preserve this core policy concern of preventing transnational terrorist threats to the US or Western homelands? Is this now the best hope that Western governments have?
You know, it's interesting because I think the wish of the Biden administration, and I think in the language of the official today, there was an attempt to sort of situate the threat of terrorism emanating from Afghanistan within this larger basket of concerns and geopolitical priorities. And I find the deprioritization of counterterrorism to be an entirely appropriate and welcome in the face of climate change and great power politics and other questions. I think the concern for me is that the kind of tolerance that Asfandyar was talking about in the region, for example, for non-state armed actors to kind of coexist, for violence to be at varying grades, I don't think that tolerance exists in the United States. And so I think, I'm not sure that exists in Western Europe either. And so I think my concern is that a single spectacular attack of some sort could get us right back to, where we were on September 11th, which would not necessarily mean that terrorism should have been or has always been the most pressing threat, but I have a feeling the national security establishment would respond to it as such. I think, so that's one concern. I think the other question is, what does managing it without a troop presence actually look like? One of the things that really did not, in my opinion, receive the type of attention that it should have during the Obama administration was a willingness to operate in a kind of not peace, not war mode in a lot of the places where these types of Salafist networks operate. And I think there are real costs to that in terms of the politics of making decisions domestically about whether the United States is or is not at war in a particular place, questions around the laws of war and adherence to them, around transparency, a reliance on technology like drone warfare. These are instruments not without their costs. I fear we will go back to relying on governments, on regimes that will do some of the dirty work for or with us, give us platforms from which to operate, that we will think about what kind of non-state armed actors would be sympathetic proxies that we can partner with to fight the worst bad guy of the day. So, I think there's been such a focus on the ongoing troop presence and the need to bring the war to an end. But there are ways of the war continuing. And I would be quite surprised, frankly, if they didn't, given President Biden, when he was vice president, he had a counterterrorism concern throughout. What he didn't want was the big military footprint and the state building and all of that. But that's, these other mechanisms are just war by other means. And I always saw the 2,500 troops, or before that, the 5,000 troops, as a political tool as much as anything else, and a way of thinking, of leveraging that presence for diplomatic reasons. So I guess my fear would be that this whole thing just moves into the shadows. Will it be effective? I guess it depends on what one's idea of effective is. If it means, for example, relying on the Pakistani security establishment as a partner in counter extremism, that to me is not a preferable option to a 2,500 troops on the ground. If it means relying on a particular Salafist group that seems less extremist or less global in its jihadi orientation, that to me is not necessarily a preferable outcome to 2,500 troops on the ground.
This is a very good point. It seems that the way I'm reading it, it seems that there are two issues, that broad issues that the Biden administration has to contend with. One is, where in the list of policy priorities does terrorism lie? And clearly, the Biden administration has decided that the global challenge is China, climate change in a less urgent way, and that terrorism is a lower issue. And then the second issue is how you deal with that terrorism, and whether a large militarized, or at least boots on the ground presence is the way to do that. But I wonder if in fact this sort of not war, not peace method of prosecuting a terrorism problem, as long as, of course, it is managed and as long as efforts are made to ensure that it's more legal, that there's some form of transparency. In reality, if you are contending with very big, urgent global problems, this may be the way to sort of risk manage the issue of terrorism, rather than to treat terrorism as the sort of the be all and end all, the thing that all other policy priorities get sacrificed for, which is not a good way to carry on either. And indeed, maybe this is a way to sort of gradually build that resilience, which is what we've lacked, right? We've always had this sort of zero tolerance approach to terrorism, and maybe this is the way to get past that. Unless you guys have anything to add on this counterterrorism issue, I want to move on to the peace process and Afghanistan itself. Asfandyar, you have a point?
Yeah, so really quickly, as Dipali noted, as you argued, and as the senior administration official, the anonymous official today said, that the reason to pull out is to focus on, the great power competition priorities, and the fallback, right, is going to be offshore counterterrorism. But I've been working the counterterrorism portfolio in and around South Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan for a while. But the more I look at it, the more it becomes clear to me that having a credible offshore counterterrorism option requires compromises specifically on great power competition priorities. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. Right? So, central to any offshore counterterrorism option are going to be bases that you can fly surveillance platforms from for monitoring threats that might develop inside Afghanistan. You might also want some kind of outposts to infiltrate assets, or to permit assets to come to you, which might have information or other kind of details. And in order to have these kinds of capabilities, you need bases. And where do you need these bases? You need them either in Central Asia, or you need them in Pakistan. And even if you don't need these bases, at the very least, you need some kind of air lines of communication, so to be able to access this, this landlocked country, Afghanistan. And in order to achieve, even a minimal posture, and ideally the best case posture, you have to contend with some very difficult regimes that the United States government has not had good relationships with. So take Pakistan, for example. The US-Pakistan relationship has been dysfunctional for a long period of time. Pakistan remains obstinate, is not cooperative, on U.S. counterterrorism concerns. And putting a base in Pakistan would require contending with not just the Pakistani military or intelligence services, but also China. China has a growing footprint in that country, and China potentially will have a veto on any kind of U.S. basing in Pakistan. Similarly, in Central Asia, Russia wields a lot of influence there, and if you're going to develop a major counterterrorism base, the Russians are going to be concerned, and they're going to exercise their influence and leverage in that region. So I'm not saying these bases are impossible, that you can't obtain them, but in order to obtain them, in order to have a credible posture, you have to work with these geopolitical adversaries and perhaps concede them in great power competition in order to obtain these counterterrorism goals. So I hope the administration is aware and is factoring these in these considerations. And because for now, my concern is that they're understating the challenge that lies ahead. Stop there.
That's a very important insight, because we've often and I'm guilty of this, considered terrorism to be a separate and competing priority to great power competition. But in fact, as you said, they are intimately related. Let me move on to the intra-Afghan process, the Turkey conference, which was, I think, never formally announced, but to the extent that we were expecting it, has probably now been postponed.
The postponement, actually, Arzan, was announced today.
Oh, right. See, there you go. I missed that.
Yeah.
Thank you for.
Yeah.
Thanks for
to begin on the 24th of April, I think.
Okay, great. Good to know. Thank you for that. So when it does proceed, this earlier concept, which we now realize is defunct, of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, suggests that there has to be some sort of phased or sequenced approach to the mess of issues, the tangle of issues. So let me ask you, Dipali, if and when this begins, this process, or when this process begins, what do you see as being the priority issues that they do triage, that they do focus on first? And by extension, then, what are the issues that get either shelved or left for later, or left out entirely?
I mean, I think it has to be said at the outset here that this announcement today, I think, really profoundly reduces the likelihood of a productive negotiation in Istanbul. I think it's not clear to me that the Taliban will change their mind about attending. And if they don't attend, there's no negotiation, obviously, at that moment. I think one of the interesting moves that the Biden administration made was to field this draft peace agreement a few weeks ago. I use the word interesting, maybe euphemistically, so I should explain what I mean. Interesting, I think, in that it generated a lot of conversation in Kabul. I think it made clear to the Afghan government that the Biden administration is serious about moving this thing forward, that I think there was some real misconception in Kabul that, now that it's the Biden administration, not the Trump administration, the clock goes back to zero. I think this was useful in that way. And I think it laid out some of the big questions that need to be addressed, to your question early on, which is, will there be an interim arrangement while a reworking of the Constitution happens? What kind of power sharing will be involved in that interim arrangement? What sort of role might there be for a clerical type of council, which was posed? What kind of role or no role will there be for parliament, subnationally, etc.? All the kind of the nuts and bolts questions of that were put on the table. The thing that I think it also did was signal to the parties that the US government and the international community more generally recognize that there is really no such thing as Afghan-owned, Afghan-led. There is, from 2001 onwards, the international community and all of its different, fractured and contradictory elements, it has been intimately involved in shepherding this process. And at every moment when questions have had to be made about power sharing, about what type of institutional legal provisions should exist, etc., the internationals have been at the table and engaged. And this draft reminded everyone of that, I think reassured a lot of parties about that. And now this announcement today suggests actually, hopefully something interesting and useful can happen in Istanbul, but the decision of most concern to the Taliban, which is, are there going to be Americans on the ground or not, is now disconnected from that. So I think the best that we could hope for through the Istanbul process, a couple of things. One would be that the Taliban agrees to come. Two would be that the Afghan government side can work out its own internal incoherences and get a group together and a sense of a substantive set of interests that it can bring to the table. And three, that the possibilities for an internationalizing, an appropriate, productive type of internationalizing of these negotiations can happen. In other words, can the UN be brought in productively through the presence of an envoy? I think one of the things that's been clear in Doha is the Afghan parties have said they don't want a mediator. For reasons that are to some degree understandable, but those of us who've been watching are wondering, at some point you really need a mediator. You need some third party to help you think through, to do things like put forward a draft like this. So I think those types of questions of what will the role of the UN be? What will the role of Turkey be? What will the ongoing role of Qatar be? Other actors that are, other countries that are in the mix. I'm hoping that some of that, the shift can move away, but I think it's a real, the possibilities are deflated, I think, in my view, as a result of this. And I'm sorry, I'm going on, but the last thing I'll say is that's the part that puzzles me a little bit about this recent announcement vis-a-vis the Blinken letters and then the draft. It seemed like the administration was saying, we're not around indefinitely. We are going to use the ambiguity about when we're leaving to move this thing and say, like, this is a real peace process and you all need to do things and behave as if it's real. To then pull the rug out from under it in this way strikes me as a bit odd, and I'm curious about what that means, about how the administration came to that decision. But I think what I've laid out is sort of my best hope for what's possible now.
So just to clarify, and I think you made this clear towards the end, that the reason that this announcement changes things is because prior to this announcement, there was ambiguity, despite the May 1 deadline being ostensibly on paper the deadline for withdrawal. There was still an expectation that was going to be violated one way or the other. Now there seems to be a renewed commitment to withdraw by a certain date, right? So that's why you're saying that.
Yes, no matter what, right?
Right.
I mean, underscored multiple times,
right.
No matter what, meaning no matter even if no one shows up in Istanbul.
Right. So and on that issue, when you said Istanbul would be a success in part just if the Talibs show up, am I correct in then joining the dots that you would suggest that the reason they would not show up is because they think they can win, quote unquote, through other mechanisms?
Yes.
on the battlefield by just waiting out the process.
Yes.
Right. Right. Okay. So if that's the case, then am I to take it that your view of the prospect of power sharing is pretty dim, right? If that is correct, then it sounds like the idea of some sort of transitional arrangement where power is shared, we now have a new reason for why the Taliban would not want to be part of such a power sharing arrangement. And correct me if I'm wrong, it seemed as though Washington was already convinced that President Ghani was not a reliable prospect for that power sharing. Where does that leave the prospect of power sharing? It sounds like neither side now wants to do that.
I mean, I have, Asfandyar referenced my first book, which was about warlord commanders who became provincial governors. And it's really a book about the politics of power sharing in a certain way. I'm very sanguine about the possibilities of power sharing if we were at a particular stage in the negotiations. In other words, I think that Afghan political elites, and both through constitutional arrangements which have existed, the 1931 Constitution was quite a clever mechanism by which to bring in more hardcore Islamists with modernists, etc. I think there are ways within Afghan politics for power sharing to happen. I think the tricky part is, since 2001, those power sharing agreements, flawed and fragile as they've been, have been brokered as a function of an understanding that the internationals are there to support that process and are going to use leverage in both directions. I think the issue to me now is that the Taliban, I don't think, really has an incentive to engage in a discussion even about power sharing, if it will be able to claim victory in September, if it may be operating on an assumption, which may be false, but wouldn't be irrational, that the current government will soon after collapse. At which point, my thought would be the impetus for most parties would be to go back to a war-fighting posture, and we get back into a dynamic that I think we were in the early 90s, where it's not worth it to negotiate away power under those circumstances. It's better to fight for another day and see what you can get that way.
Right. So it sounds like with these parties seeing no real benefit in engaging in this process as it currently stands, it seems though in recent years that the Taliban has been in the ascendancy. And if that is the case, and assuming that there are no winner take all in Afghanistan, that there will always be a residual resistance or opposition to whoever is in power in Kabul, unless there's a negotiated settlement. I wonder, and I want to turn to the regional piece before we end, but just before we do the regional piece, I wonder from both of yours perspective, it seems like the trend in the balance of power, for want of a better term, or the relative power between the Taliban and the current government in Kabul is in favor of the Taliban. So I wonder, what is the source of strength that is allowing the Taliban to continually be making these inroads across the country? And despite the massive support that Kabul is receiving, it seems to be losing power and influence. So is this a trend that we can expect to see continuing, especially once the US withdraws troops?
I agree. I think the trend of power, the balance of power, is in the favor of the Taliban. And if there's one factor I was to point out why that is, why are the Taliban ascendant? My diagnosis is that the Taliban has a lot more cohesion, as an organization, as a political organization, especially compared to the Afghan Republic. So there is intra-elite unity. There are no signs of major factionalism, splintering, despite the fact that U.S. counterinsurgency and U.S. counterterrorism strategy has been premised on driving these wedges, on on sort of fracturing the Taliban as a political movement. You don't see these kinds of political problems. There is also a lot of vertical strength. With the rank and file, the Taliban's military and political machine is looking more formidable than it has ever been, and it has certainly benefited from the U.S. negotiating with it. The fact that the U.S. has struck this deal has helped the Taliban solidify itself politically. So I think
sorry to interrupt, Asfandyar, and I am sorry, but just can you go one step deeper and explain to me why the Taliban, despite having multiple shura, despite straddling multiple tribal networks, is so cohesive? Well, I mean, what is it that makes it so cohesive? Is it the sort of resistance to foreign occupation idea?
Honestly, I don't have a good answer, and I don't think anyone else has either, right? We don't know why the Taliban take. People used to argue that it's because of the quality of external support, but Pakistan has supported armed groups in Kashmir as well, and there the insurgency is fractured, is politically divided, has all sorts of problems. So I don't think it's external support. Perhaps ideology is doing some heavy lifting in this case. It's an important question, and I really hope historians, political scientists, other analysts will try to solve this mystery. But I see signs of cohesion in the mid-ranking cadres of the Taliban, at the highest level, at the ground level. There's a lot of political strength, and compare that to what's going on with the Republic. So Dipali was in Kabul more recently than when I was there. So can speak to some of these dynamics better than me. But my sense is that the Republic is extremely divided. There's some serious fractures. The fact that Dr. Abdullah, who's supposed to be a partner in power to President Ghani, in some ways he sees President Ghani as a bigger problem than the Taliban. I think that that remains a big problem. Other major leaders of the Republic, like President Ashraf Ghani or Professor Sayyaf, they don't get along with President Ghani either. So, the Republic has a multitude of political challenges which weaken it at the level of politics. And these differences also manifest in, say, in the security sector, the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Defense, the Afghan security forces. You see these political challenges manifesting on the battlefield. So as a result of that, I think this the balance of power right now is really with the Taliban. And once U.S. forces pull out, the concern is that the Taliban may not even have to put up a fight to get to Kabul, right? That you might, that's the worst case. I'm not saying it's going to happen. Perhaps some of these worst case scenarios are overplayed, and I'm open to that possibility. But the concern is that the Republic will politically fragment, right? Once there is a signal to the Afghan polity that that the U.S. military is out, that U.S. support is now going to come down, you might see a political meltdown. And in that scenario, I think power can shift in favor of the Taliban even more.
Maybe a slightly different spin on this question of power balance. I don't see the Taliban as being advantaged in the sense that, okay, they form an insurgency whose requirements in terms of success are to be profoundly disruptive and to hold territory and gain it if they can. And they're clearly extraordinarily good at doing that. And I share Asfandyar's wish that somebody one day will unlock this puzzle of what it is that has made them as coherent and effective and resilient a fighting force as they are. They also are quite capable in the area of rebel governance, in certain rural areas. And, we have new research again that we've been supporting that shows this, that not that they have an agile, quite interesting way of thinking about governance as rebels as well. But I think that task is very, very different from the task of being the government. And for them, it is not the 1990s. So let's assume they were to be able to take Kabul, which I'll come to, I don't think they would. They're then dealing with an urbanized, young, globally connected Afghan population. So they may be able to get away with, or even have some sympathy for, their ideology in rural Pashtun areas. But once they have never been able to hold a city. And the country is just fundamentally different than it would. The majority of the population were not alive during the time of the Taliban, right? The average age, I think, is 18 or 19. So I'm not convinced that their strength as a war-fighting force would translate into a capacity to hold power, let alone to govern. The other thing I will say I fully agree with Asfandyar's analysis of the Republic, which is that it's fractured, the extraordinary infighting. I think the palace is incredibly isolated. I do think, though, that all of these different factions, the one thing on which they can agree is that they are better off under the Republic than they were before. And so I think if it came to a fight, they would fight for the preservation of the Republic. They would cohere around that fight to a degree to defend cities and the like. And my guess would be not that the likely outcome would be the ascendance of the Taliban. It's that it would be an even more horrific civil war, in which regional actors would then again get involved in supporting their various clientele and whatnot. So that, to me, is the more likely outcome than the return of the Taliban. I just don't see that happening in any sustained fashion.
That's a very interesting counterpoint to that idea of a Taliban rush to return to power. But the requirement for that to happen, is it not, is continued international support for the Republic. So the follow-on question is, if we want to avoid a repeat of Najibullah, what is required of the international community to support the Republic? Is it just bagfuls of money, or other forms of support that would be necessary to give the Republic a fighting chance once the troops pull out, once leverage declines? Because also we should, as an addendum, remind people that it's not just the US troops that are going to pull out, but once the US troops are pulling out, basically the entire coalition is. So once that happens, what forms of support does the Republic require?
I think it's very important that the United States government tries to marshal international support to communicate to the Taliban that look, a rush to Kabul is unacceptable. Not sharing power is not on, and I think you need to get the Russians and the Chinese to sign on onto this bottom line. And for now, I don't see evidence of that. Yes, the Troika Plus exists, and the Troika Plus has issued a statement which can amount to that, but this needs to be stated, communicated much more clearly. The Taliban need to know that they will be an international pariah for them to be deterred. Then, in terms of leverage, I think UN sanctions are this underappreciated source of leverage. The Taliban respond to them. The Taliban want these sanctions to be lifted. They also realize, given their experience in the 90s, that if they remain sanctioned through the UN, that will make it very difficult for them to reach out to a lot of countries. It will make even small things like international travel very difficult. Like, for instance, right now when when the Taliban's diplomatic delegation based out of Doha wants to travel. My sense is that it's the U.S. Special Envoy's office which submits these requests, these travel exemptions to the UN, and then they're able to travel from Qatar to all of these countries. So that's an important source of support, and I really hope that the U.S. government exercises this leverage very carefully, doesn't concede these sanctions, early on. Then, of course, Pakistan. I don't know what it will take to convince or get Pakistan to support this particular effort. The Trump administration tried engaging Pakistan with both, threat of sanctions as well as some inducements, later in the term. The Biden administration doesn't have a Pakistan policy, from all I can tell. But I think it's important to engage the Pakistanis and see what it is that they want and what are some of the minimal terms that they might agree to. The final thing is aid, and I think maintaining military aid, clearly signaling that military aid will continue to Afghan security forces, will prevent defections. My concern, I noted this earlier, are wholesale defections of entire regiments and corps, for instance. You don't want them swinging towards the Taliban. That's the nightmare scenario that I worry about. And I think signaling that aid will continue will be helpful in preventing that type of political meltdown.
And I would absolutely echo all of these points, and I would also say, I heard President Biden being interviewed recently about Afghanistan. I think it was Margaret Brennan said to him, well, won't you feel guilty, if women are basically sent back to the Stone Age under the Taliban? And he said, no, I will not feel guilty, because there are women who are suffering in many different countries under many different circumstances. And, I have a lot of, I'm a non-interventionist, I would say, by philosophy. But I do think that one of the things that has struck me is the strange conflation between the decision to go to war somewhere and the decision about how to end a war that you have begun, right? And I was just writing actually to one of my old professors, Bill Maley, who's an old Afghan hand, asking him about this. There are just war requirements about what it justifies going to war. There are just war rules about how you conduct yourself during war. And yet I don't think, and I would love if anyone knows, I'm really interested in this, are there requirements about what a responsible exit should look like? What really struck me about today's announcement was that it read as irresponsible in a way that felt unnecessary to me. And I think the way to manage that going forward responsibly, the exit, is to do precisely what Asfandyar is saying, which is to say, okay, we have other instruments at our disposal that are non-military, that are not just American, they're multilateral. And we are, in fact, the most powerful country on the planet. We are engaging with a robust, but still an insurgency, which is not even a particularly popular insurgency in Afghanistan. The Afghan government, profoundly flawed as it is the start of a democracy in the region. It's a population whose lives have been transformed for the better as a function of the Western intervention therein. Again, flawed as it has been. And there are opportunities to right-size the relationship so that it doesn't take this huge disproportionate role in US foreign policy as it has over the last 2 decades, but that are about thinking about partnership and supporting the government through security sector assistance, but also through our visa policy, through Fulbright scholarships. American University of Afghanistan is a remarkable institution of higher education. There are many ways of making clear that these gains are of great value, not just to Afghans, but to all of us, that we have in fact invested enormously in them, and that there's no reason to walk away from them irresponsibly. It's not the right thing to do, and it's not the smart thing to do. And I hope that anybody listening takes notes on what Asfandyar said, because I think those are exactly things that are available to us that are not costly, and they must be done. They must be pursued.
That's excellent. And I want to, yeah, I'll give you a chance, Asfandyar, in a second. I want to, before I wear out my welcome entirely, we've already started speaking about the regional piece. And I just want to sort of focus on that a little bit, and hopefully this will dovetail nicely with whatever follow-ons you have, Asfandyar. But I want to focus in particular on the role of Pakistan, because this is one of the sources of, or has been traditionally one of the sources of the Taliban's strength, the safe haven, the support. Is there, we've seen some remarkable potential signs of change in policy in Pakistan in recent weeks. Does that portend anything when they start talking about geoeconomics, for example? Does that portend anything for the Pakistan approach to Afghanistan, and in particular to the Taliban? Is there a shift there that could be productive?
The short answer is I'm skeptical. I don't think this the push for geoeconomics, the strategy that some Pakistani policymakers, even the Pakistani army chief, has spoken about, is going to alter the policy that Pakistan has pursued in Afghanistan with respect to the Taliban. That being said, I think it's important to note some subtle shifts in Pakistani strategy over the last, say, decade or half a decade. So I think from 2008 through 2015-16, the Pakistani state pursued a fairly offensive strategy of supporting the Taliban, of course, politically, but also materially. And I think we see a shift in gears in the early years of the Trump administration. It's unclear why that shift takes place, but there are signs that it is around this time that Pakistan starts telling the Taliban that look, you've got to restrain your violence against US personnel, for instance. There are also signs of some pressure being mounted by Pakistan against the Taliban, specifically to the end of Pakistan, of the Taliban signing an agreement with the US. And multiple US officials have acknowledged this particular point. But since the signing of the Doha Accord, we once again see the Pakistanis taking a step back. And while they appear to have nudged the Taliban that, look, why don't you go to Turkey and see what it's like, right? I think they haven't done more. They haven't brought to bear their, the full weight of their influence. The question is why. The easy answer, obviously, is that that Pakistan wants a full-fledged Taliban return to power. I think that's very plausible. It's been that's been the de facto Pakistani policy. But at the same time, I think there's something to be said about the fact that U.S. policy has been drifting. Since February 2020. With the combination of the pandemic and the Trump administration, the fact that the Biden administration hasn't given any clear-cut direction. I think perhaps that might have also played into why Pakistani policy has not been, say, more helpful. But that's where the situation stands. I think looking ahead, Pakistan has been enlisting both the Russians and the Chinese for support for its Afghan policy. Pakistan has been selling the Taliban to both of those countries, and it appears that both of those countries are buying into Pakistan's pitch. Russian talking points have, over the last year or so, become very similar to Pakistani talking points. So looking ahead, I see this particular bloc, the Pakistanis, the Russians, and the Chinese as being on one side, and the US and its allies being on the other.
Can I just underscore one point that Asfandyar made earlier about this relationship? I mean, one of the Gordian knots always of the US-Pakistan relationship during the war was that attempts to exert greater leverage on Pakistan, in order to exact better behavior on its part to get it to put pressure on the Taliban. The limit on that was that the entire war was being physically supplied through Pakistan into Afghanistan because it's a landlocked country and because these other access points were not available. One interesting question will be, now there will be no more troops. And so at least theoretically, that obviates the need to be deferential to Pakistan as a function of this supply line. What I want to underscore is Asfandyar's earlier point, which is a shift to a remote CT management approach may in fact actually elevate Pakistan's importance in the region. As either for intelligence sharing, as a base, for whatever reasons there may be, that could once again put us back into the very situation that we deemed to be so problematic and difficult. I mean, Afghans always will steer the conversation to Pakistan when talking about anything that has to do with the war, because fundamentally they never have quite understood why this war was being waged in Afghanistan when the sanctuary was over the border, and that US-Pakistan relationship never seemed to really shift. And so I think the concern for me would be that a CT approach that is remotely managed may entrap us in the very same dysfunctional relationship if we're not thinking carefully about it. And I do think that Asfandyar's point about we haven't really heard much about the US-Pakistan relationship of late. Perhaps the uneasing of a relationship with the US and Iran over a very long time could ease the reliance on Pakistan, but I don't think any of us can bank on that. And so I think that continues to be a question to me that is not actually alleviated at all by the end of the war.
That's interesting because in the reporting today on the troop withdrawal, it's expressly stated that having a conditions-based withdrawal is just a recipe for perpetual war. And yet what I'm hearing is that even with a deadline, non-conditions-based withdrawal, it's this Gordian knot will persist as long as there is a terrorist threat, and as long as counterterrorism remains a policy priority. There's no real way to escape that problem. I am really conscious that I've overstayed my welcome. I have a couple of concluding comments, but I want to give you guys one last chance to put in a plug for anything that I've missed that you think is an important issue, or any concluding remarks before I wrap up.
The final point I'll make is something she said about President Biden and this video of his, this short snippet of comment which has been circulating, in which he says that there are 10 places out there where there's a lot of injustice and I could be sending US troops to those places. I think that comparison is really off, and it's really troubling. And I really hope that the administration in general, and President Biden in particular, feels some moral burden of the US involvement in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is different from those 10 places for the mere reason that the United States invaded that particular country, right, in a bid to secure itself. So it's not like those 10 other places where there is a lot of injustice. The fact that Afghanistan is so dysfunctional and is experiencing so many different problems, it is in part due to the many policies that the United States government has pursued in that country. So I really hope policymakers don't just wash their hands off and say that this is yet another sort of broken place that they can't do much about. I think that the US has to take more burden, more responsibility, even in a withdrawal mode, even when it doesn't have troops in that country, and that can range from facilitating visas for people who helped the United States, in this long war, to maintaining some kind of aid, economic aid, perhaps even military aid in support of the Afghan government. I think the U.S. government, the American people owe that to the Afghan people.
That's really beautifully said, and I think that's to me also precisely the right note to end on. I think sometimes these, the Afghan problem, as it were, it can be so easily reduced to thinking about this place as ungovernable, tribal, radicalized. It's, these are the kind of tropes I think that emerge. And first of all, anyone who has spent any time there knows what an extraordinary country and people it is, but also understands how heavy the American footprint in the region has been for decades in contributing to the very problems that the people have suffered with for decades of time. And so, the thinking about countries far away as sites for which, we have there are certain things coming out of there that are problematic, or certain things that we need, that we want to get. This kind of transactional way of understanding international relations really absolves and obscures the responsibilities that the U.S. has had in that part of the world and continues to have, but also kind of neglects the possibilities for a really productive relationship, I think, that is possible between the two societies, but also between the governments. And I think even without troops on the ground, there are many things that we've tried to highlight that the US government can do to give the best chance for peace and improved governance there in a kind of right-sized relationship between our two countries.
That's a great note to end on, both of you guys. I hope we managed to get to a couple of the questions from Zoomland, but I wanted to, again, thank you for lending your expertise. One of the things, I promised that we would try and address some of the underlying trends and implications of the news today, and I think you did that superbly. And one of the themes through a lot of our comments today was that we keep analyzing Afghanistan as a thing out there, as an object of analysis or an object of policy action, without fully appreciating exactly how our own actions and presence impacts it. So it's not just the troop withdrawal, of course. It's not just how many troops leave, but also the cascading effects that might have on the intra-Afghan process, as you mentioned, Dipali. But it's really interesting that when the US and the coalition withdraws, there's diametrically opposed plausible scenarios that could play out. There could be a positive feedback loop where the Taliban has a rush to power, or there could be a negative feedback loop where the Western withdrawal creates greater resistance to the Taliban than we've seen. And of course, as you mentioned, the presence over the last couple of decades of US troops and money, and Western troops and money, has created a fairly artificial situation, a fairly artificial republic. And so it's not just a matter of how it can persist, but how our changed relationship with it will change the prospects for Afghanistan. And it is not, as you mentioned, there's a great point that it's not unrelated to other policy concerns that we may have as far away as East Asia. It's intimately related to that. And of course, there is a moral burden, as you put it, and a requirement to think about a just withdrawal, not just a just war. So thank you very much, Dipali and Asfandyar. I hope this has been a useful and a slightly deeper analysis of the news today, and we'll keep tracking it. Thanks, guys.